Good to go.
Welcome, everyone, to Senate Education, Wednesday, April 26th. A few things on the agenda. We're going to start with Senator Chittenden, who's going to propose an idea to the committee, an amendment to the budget. We're then going to return to the question of PCV testing in schools with Dr. Carrie Hornbuckle, and then we will return to H461, our discussion on bullying, harassment, then public school admissions, which is really connected to 483, and then 494, an act relating to making appropriations. This is actually some follows up on Senator Chittenden's language that we're going to hear about now. Just generally, I did expect the floor to go much longer. But since we got off, I appreciate Senator Chittenden joining us. Senator Chittenden, great to see you. And do you have copies of your amendment? Oh, we have them in our folder. Thank you. So we are looking, Senator Chittenden is putting forward language. Let's see. It says Senators A, B, C, D, E move that the report on the Committee of Appropriations. Okay, so please tell us what you're thinking. Tell us why you decided to choose to do it with Senate Ed. Tell us a few things that you'd like to see happen.
Well, I'll give some background. I also just want to realize that I've been to this committee a few times now, and whenever I get invited to a House committee, I always, the first time, show up with donuts, and it's always resulted in better results. So, the next time I come down to Senate Education, I'm bringing donuts. Okay, I owe you all donuts.
Senator Mazza sent us a bag of potatoes on your behalf. So,
yeah. So I think the reason why I'm here is a couple of, I have a constituent who is also a very knowledgeable person that works in this field, and he's also associated with the National Association of Energy Services Companies. He's contacted me over the years through a variety of different hats that I've worn around school construction. So I don't know if any of you recall, but back in 2020, the city of South Burlington, the school district of South Burlington, proposed to do a massive reconstruction, a completely new build of the high school and middle school. It was a $217 million project, and it was not approved by the voters. The point is, in those conversations and the resulting conversations, individuals like this gentleman have made very eloquent arguments, or not arguments, but statements that it's important to have people around the table that understand how to retrofit and energy improve existing infrastructures, because there are a lot of things that can be done. So what his organization, well, his company and affiliated organization focuses on is performance energy improvements to municipal facilities. So he reached out to me last Thursday. We had a phone call. I believe because I did previously serve on this illustrious committee, and so that he's spoken to me about it before.
To get that we illustrious, I just want to
looked at you and said,
and the camera's rolling. Please continue.
And they had the conversation of, he heard about the working group task force on school construction aid, which, by the way, fully support all of your efforts. I think that is the right direction to go in. And as he was looking at the composition of that, as well as other individuals he knows in other states, he just saw an opportunity to at least consider an additional member, somebody on that working group that would also represent an organization that does have some expertise in performance-based contracting. Some arguments. So with this proposal that I was inspired to do so from friends in the building, after hearing from Eric Lafayette, they caught me on yesterday morning and just said, hey, this seems to make sense, and I don't know if your committee considered adding that member to this body, but if you look at the 15-member composition, this amendment proposes to add an appointment by the governor. But I mean, really, I would love for this. I think it makes the most sense if you all support this to bring it forward. Happy to do so if you prefer, but I am not bringing this forward unless the committee of jurisdiction supports it. It's a lesson I've learned earlier this session. Yeah, trying to be funny there. All right. If you all do support this and would like me to do the legwork, I'd be happy to. Alternatively, what this was proposed to do, as I got feedback from Senator Kitchell, because it is the budget bill that this would be proposed to amend to, she suggested A, you can talk to this committee, and B, she also said, if you add another member that go to 16 from 15, it gets a little unwieldy. In that conversation, she also posited, but again, I look to you all as your reaction. What if we just reduce the number of House representatives from 2 to 1 and senators from 2 to 1. So we have 1 from each chamber, and then that would bring it down to 13. And then if you added this one, it'd go to 14. And then there's been other conversations as well about other compositions. Who's around the table matters, and I think it would be really important for this group to have a perspective that knows what it takes to retrofit and create energy efficiencies while addressing HVAC system upgrades, so that the body doesn't necessarily default to complete rebuilds. Because complete rebuilds, as much as they might make sense in certain circumstances, I think there is value to have differing expert perspectives at the table to weigh the pros and cons from using an existing infrastructure and modernizing it, making the old new, which I've seen creatively done in a lot of different places. The old McDonald's in downtown Burlington, the farmhouse group, you can tell it's the old McDonald's.
Oh,
Yeah.
what's there now?
It's the farmhouse.
Right.
On Bank Street. Yeah.
So that's what this proposal effectively does, is just to add a member that represents from, I don't recall what the final language is from, with school energy efficiency and energy performance contracting. There is a nationally recognized organization if you want to be more specific than that, but I think this would get you elsewhere.
My question is, does he want to be on this group or does he want to be on the group that's actually going to be doing the work? Like this, correct me if I'm wrong, guys, but this task force, I think, is pretty much just going to be working this summer in anticipation of that study coming out. And then, I mean, especially if you follow the Rhode Island model, then there will be like this oversight body that will be created that will be working for, I don't know, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years, who knows, and actually doing the work of, retrofitting schools and choosing how that's going to happen. And I'm just wondering if he understands that this group isn't really getting into the weeds in that way.
I wouldn't be able to speak for him. I don't even think I recall him saying he wants to be the one. I think he just sees a need for somebody that knows. And as I looked at the composition and I saw somebody with expertise in building development or construction, I just thought, retrofitting energy performance improvements also might balance that out. But you raise a good point.
Yeah, and I also had a request from a student who thinks we should have a student rep on this group. So I wanted to bring that to you, but sorry, I can do that later, but I wanted to bring that up. And also, didn't we originally have 1 senator and 1 House rep? And then,
Did, and then we, the House asked us to add
Yeah.
another, and we added, but we can easily pull it back, which I'm more than comfortable doing personally. I would leave it up to all of you. So it'd be reducing down to 13 and then bumping up a student, possibly this person, or a student and another person. Ms. Conline, do you mind weighing in on this a little bit? Are you interested in just, you can say there, Senator Clinton,
Yeah, so I'm just texting about another group and we're not aware there is another group.
okay,
It's our impression this is the group.
oh, no. I mean, it is the group for now.
This is the group
but-
that's going to design the state aid program. I'm
Correct.
confirming.
yeah.
So that is the group that they were thinking, and as
Okay.
Senator Schmidt said, they were looking for somebody with expertise in performance-based contracting to have a voice there, so we
Sure.
know what the alternatives are.
Okay,
They're also very knowledgeable in leveraging federal money as well and grant money, so that's
Oh,
another thing.
awesome. great. No, it sounds good to me.
So is there one person in the state? I'm assuming we would ask, we could either ask the governor's office, the state, somebody would have to nominate. We don't put names, of course, in these kinds of things.
Treasurer was another.
The treasurer is a possibility for the treasurer to appoint somebody. But when this happens, I'm just trying to get a little bit of a sense of, do we know if there are many people out there that do this work? If all of a sudden this person seems great, but if not, is this going to slow the process down in any way that, gosh, we just can't find the right person because there's only one in the state and nobody thinks he's the right.
There's more than one in the state.
And that's where I might bring attention back to the National Association of Energy Services Companies, NASCO. They might be a better appointing body to have that broader expertise and maybe somebody that does in fact generally offer perspectives on this important topic.
Senator Weeks, Senator Williams.
Well, I would just assume that the governor's office would have would be open to these types of recommendations on where to source, I'd leave the decision up to them.
In terms of what person.
In terms of which person it says.
I'm just thinking about having somebody on there that is involved in the process and then they find out, maybe they want to bid on the job. So they become.
Well, that's a risk. But they would have to
They would have
That could happen with the hygiene too, the industrial hygienist, and so we'll have to make sure that that gets taken care of. But yeah, my only other worry is that if the movies might get a little unwieldy, but otherwise it seems.
And just so we know, so do you want to say anything else about the student? I think it's a good idea. We've heard from the students.
Yeah.
And who would appoint the student in your mind who would be good? No, it's either the governor, no, it's not the chair, it's the committee, committees, it could be the secretary, it could be Philip, it could be,
I haven't really got that far.
okay. All right, so we're gonna meet later and talk about this, but any other questions or concerns? If this were to go forward as an amendment from Senator Chittenden, subtract a House member, subtract a senator, and then we bump up and we add somebody from, the space contractor, space as in this kind of space, not outer space, and then we would also add a student. We could ask Becky Wasserman to draft that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I want to reiterate for you all that this task force shall cease to exist on July 1st, 2024. Okay. Yeah, and then there will be hopefully another like governing body that'll be doing this work for years to come, maybe decades. So he may also want to be part of that group.
Crafting a state aid program, I think it'd be a good value perspective to know what that might entail.
Gotcha.
Happy to bring it forward, and I will only do so though if this committee
Yep,
supports
nope.
it.
Am I seeing any objections on what the senator is putting forward?
We support you without the
If there's
donuts.
anybody else but
Sans
you.
donuts.
And they're looking for this tomorrow, so I hate to put time pressure on.
No, there's no, have you let Ms. Wasserman know that we're reducing the size with House and Senate, we're adding a student, and we're adding your person, and then the question is, who does the appointments? Yes.
Yeah, I'd like to kind of, I agree with everything that Senator Chittenden's proposed, and I understand the reshuffling and redistribution of participants. I don't think a student is necessary. Being that everybody on the committee at one point been a student, I think they can come to that perspective. I think it's nice to have, kind of fluffy, not necessary.
Is it fluffy?
Fluffy.
Yeah.
Fluffy.
It's nice to have. I don't think it's necessary.
We give the House 2 seats and then the Senate 1, but I really.
No, I don't think we do that. Yeah, I mean, I still,
Keep it on. is what I was
I
thinking.
do, the reason I like the idea of the students, these guys are living it right now more than anybody. But it's the committee's decision. What do you think, Senator McEwen?
I like the idea too. I also like the idea of having 2 senators. We were talking about a bipartisan group.
Now it would just be Senator Weeks on it.
Senator Buell.
We'll see.
Why don't we just, I guess I would suggest just keep it as is, add the student, add this person. And this is gonna be summer and fall work. People won't be able to show up to all the meetings, and we'll just do the best that we can with what we have.
Not drop the rep and the senators, what you just said.
I'm fine with. Does anyone, I mean, I know it's getting big.
It's getting big.
Yeah.
I think if we drop 2 and add 2, I think the chair of probes would also, that means we're spending a little tiny bit less money.
I don't know how hard she is in the position, but she.
I think she'll be fine with whatever we end up doing. We're gonna talk to Ms. Wasserman at 4:30. We'll talk to her. That'll give people a little time to think about whether they want the student. We don't want this to come to the floor, God forbid.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll have you come back at 4:30.
With donuts?
Yeah.
No, sauce donuts.
Ice cream cake.
Leftover cake.
Cake,
That cake is gone.
Yeah, long gone.
You know, I don't want too much of a debate over this. We don't have much time, but we have ledge council coming back at 4:30. So
Does it have to say an odd or even number based on?
No, I don't think it, no, I think it's just generally, it's an odd number historically, but it doesn't have to be. And nothing needs to happen. You just forget it. That's the other thing.
High school construction.
Oh, no, forget amending the school, the committee. The committee's already in the budget.
the hardest part you'll have with this whole thing is decide who's gonna be on there. You know, you have one student, it's male, then they wanna have a female on there. You know, it's, I think I like the composition the way it is, because it's simple as they start picking.
Okay. I suppose the student can always show up to the meeting, right? There's nothing
They
to
could
say
always
that
be
they
pulled in
can't.
for testimony.
Yeah.
That's certainly true. Okay. Dr. Hornbuckle? I
Yes.
presume? Yes.
Yes.
Please, would you be willing to join us at the table and welcome to Senate Education? I don't believe you're from Vermont.
I'm not. I'm
So-
from Iowa.
Or-
And would you like my card? I can leave it.
No, I mean, we believe you.
Thank you.
Trustworthy group.
I'm sorry I'm dressed so informally. I've been tromping around Vermont schools this week. It's been a wonderful work time. I've had an opportunity to see some Vermont and talk to Vermonters.
Great. So we have you here to come to talk to us about PCB testing in schools. So tell us first a little bit about yourself, why you're here and what you're doing. And then you can talk a little bit about sort of things as it relates to this committee and where things stand with PCB testing.
Sure.
And then I'm sure people have questions.
Yes. So I've been studying PCBs for about 30, almost 35
I'm sorry to
years.
interrupt. Can you just say your name for the record
Sure.
and if you're with a company or?
Yeah, I'm Carrie Hornbuckle. I'm a professor of civil and environmental engineering at the University of Iowa. I teach and do research as part of my job as a tenured professor there. Now I'm about 50% on research because we have a large research program in PCBs, actually. I've been studying these chemicals for a long time and was primarily working in ecological systems. And I was interested in how PCBs move from one state to another, like from sediment to water and water to air. And had been working in many different polluted systems around the country, from the Green Bay Fox River system in Wisconsin to the Erie, Indiana, East Chicago area, and southern Lake Michigan, Northwest Indiana, around Buffalo, New York, and then started recognizing the importance of emissions of PCBs to air from contaminated areas. And then we started working more in locations that communities were concerned about those emissions. And communities started inviting us to come, especially with respect to understanding dredging and the release of PCBs during dredging activities. And we developed computational models and measurement strategies for narrowing in on this question. So we worked in New Bedford Harbor, for example, the largest PCB Superfund site of its type in the country.
New Bedford, Mass.
In New Bedford, Massachusetts. And we went there at the request of the community and we did an extensive sampling survey and developed models to interpret data and showed the community around there that emissions were important, especially if you live close to the water. We also developed a network of measurements in the city of Chicago and ran air samplers on the back of health clinic vans that serve low-income families throughout the whole city with the intention of looking for sources, large sources of emission of PCBs, because we had discovered that emissions from Chicago explain PCB accumulation in fish in Lake Michigan. So we've become really more and more interested in how people are exposed through their exposure to PCBs, especially through Superfund sites that are either intended for cleanup or in cleanup process. People were very concerned. So we started doing this work. We did a special series of studies with communities where we measured PCBs in their blood, in the air of their homes, outside their homes, when they were near a Superfund site. And then we also had a rural community in Iowa who was supposed to be our control. We measured PCBs in their blood, in the air of their community, and in their food. We did surveys to find exactly what they ate. We went to the store and we bought it, measured their food. And then we discovered the concentrations of PCBs in their blood was about the same in this very polluted community and this rural community. And that was very confusing until we started evaluating all the ways that they absorb PCBs. And we discovered that inhalation of children in schools was important. We were very surprised to realize that the concentration of PCBs in these schools in Indiana and Iowa were sufficiently high to be equal to roughly the PCB exposure people had through their food. And that was partly because these communities were not eating a lot of fish. They're eating the American diet, and which we classify as hamburgers and French fries and food like food that is commonly purchased by low-income families. And when we started to look at why their blood levels were similar, we ended up looking more and more at the air concentrations. And that was about 2015. And at that point, when we were getting this data, I started to shift my thinking and my work to look more at why schools might have high levels and also whether they could be typical of schools. And so we began more studies of PCBs in schools in Iowa and Indiana. And we learned that the PCB levels, not only were they high, but they were also variable. They were variable from one school to another, and they were variable from one room to another. And that helped us understand that there's specific sources in schools that are legacy of the use of aerochlor mixtures that were commercially produced and sold between mostly 1950 and 1980. And so then we started to look more at the school age to see if that was a predictor, and it is. But unfortunately, older schools before 1950 were remodeled between this time period. And so the schools appeared to be, most of them that we had studied, who were built or remodeled before 1980 had PCB levels. And the concentrations of PCB levels that we were seeing in those schools were higher than we measured at any site, anywhere, next to the most contaminated Superfund sites in the country, including living right next to New Bedford Harbor, where the concentrations of PCBs we found at the highest was about 38 nanograms per cubic meter. That's living on the shore of a highly contaminated PCB site that also, yes, ma'am.
Can you give us the numbers that you were finding in the schools?
The schools that we found in Iowa and Indiana range from less than 10 nanograms per cubic meter up to about 130 nanograms per cubic meter. And compared to New Bedford Harbor or anywhere, including Chicago, all through urban Chicago, including the Fox River, including right over the Indiana Harbor Ship Canal, where the highest we saw was 38 nanograms per cubic meter. That was a big surprise to me. And so after 2015, we started doing more of these studies, and we reported a series of studies that showed that indeed schools have materials inside that recirculate and continue to release until they're removed. And working with schools in East Chicago, Indiana, we were able to show from our measurements that it was likely coming from the light ballast in their case. We're really proud when they decided to remove all the light ballast as a result of our work. So then we began to develop this technique to take a measurement and identify what are the likely types of origin.
Sorry,
Yes.
when you took the light ballast out, did the numbers go down to zero?
No, because we don't know what they did. So the school didn't invite us to come back and do more measurements. We would have liked to do so, but they didn't see the advantage of that. Maybe, we hope in the future they'll change their mind, because there's very little data like this. It's very common, that even in Superfund sites, it's also a problem. After they do the work, the reassessment is like a whole nother big study that people have mixed feelings about doing. But I'm sure it is true that they went down. The signal that we could see in the PCB signal was just like the one that we know was used as the mixture in light balance, as opposed to caulking or adhesives or hydraulic equipment. So I think it's likely it did go down.
We had, you know, the Burlington story, but in our tech center, one area in our tech center had 6,000
Yes.
milligrams per cubic meter.
I walked through that room and I saw many pieces of equipment that I'm sure were purchased during that time and had it in their hydraulic fluids, or the dielectric fluids and electrical equipment.
Yeah, and there was like a flame retardant that was put on the metal, the exposed metal as well.
Was that sampled and measured?
Mm-hmm.
And it was high?
Yeah, very
Uh-huh.
high.
When I walked through and with the consultants, and they pointed that out, we had developed an emission sampler that we're now using quite a lot in Vermont schools that measures directly what's coming off the surface. And they couldn't figure out at that time how to put it on that material because it's rough. But now we've developed a new system to measure it off of rough materials. And we're going to try that out in the future in that kind of system. Yeah. I'd like to know too how important that kind of source is. Because there's a difference, right, between whether the material is there and whether it's emitting to the air. And EPA's regulations are about the solid material and what you do when you find the solid material. But they don't have any advice.
And they have no air standards, right? So.
Their air standards are rough guidance, right? But the thing that I'm concerned about is they don't have a way to link the air concentration to the solid material. In fact, it may be counterproductive and more expensive than it needs to be. Like caulking, for example, is often this little strip. And it's sometimes really high concentrations of PCBs, but because the surface area is small, it may not be important as an emission source. Same with if the PCBs migrate into the material around after the caulking's been there a long time. Well, it may be high from EPA's perspective, it's solid material, but it may not be an emitter at all. So that's now a big focus in my laboratory, is developing systems to measure precisely and accurately the emissions off of the material and to track down specific source. It's we had a number of experiences with districts that have decided to tear down the school, like Burlington, and that's not a sustainable approach, right? And so it's a great interest to us as engineers. So we're a group of engineers and chemists and statisticians, and together we think that we can develop tools to help schools identify, okay, this thing and not that thing, that results in what you want to get to, which is way lower exposures for children. And so far, it's been very helpful, interesting. I've learned a lot.
Did you ever get down to the Albany, New York area?
No, I haven't.
GE was
Oh,
dredging the Hudson River
right.
because they had PCBs in the transformers, I think,
Yes.
and they were just dumping them in the river.
Yes.
So I'm sure there's some
I do know all
downstream
about
effect.
that.
Okay.
Yes, I know. That's of course a really famous PCB site. One of the biggest PCB, and it's also a very challenging problem. And communities, of course, in New York have been concerned that the dredging process results in increased exposure to them, and some measurements have indicated that that's the case. But again, the levels of their exposure are in the order of less than 1 nanogram per cubic meter. And what we're seeing in schools is thousands of times higher than that. And billions of dollars are spent to remediate sediments. And what are schools supposed to do, right? And you know, for us, finding cost-effective engineering solutions to this problem is really important.
I think GE cleaned that up by
They
itself.
didn't, they were required by EPA to pay for that. Yeah.
Snarky.
Thank you. So I'm really glad you brought up how to deal with this problem, because certainly knocking down every school and rebuilding is not sustainable, as you said. Totally agree with that. I would love to hear more about your ideas around renovating or whatever it is you see once you know, or mitigating, I guess is the word for the PCBs. While what we are planning to do, which is a sort of comprehensive school construction plan across our state, because we have so many buildings that are failing and so many underway, septic, HVAC, structural, you name it, we've got all the problems. How these two can sort of like not only coexist, but how they can sort of inform each other as we're moving through the process in the next, I don't know, let's say 10 years.
Yeah,
Do you have any, like, just anecdotally,
yeah.
anything you can share with us?
Well, thank you very much for asking that question. I think it's remarkable to me how much we learn with the data. We make these measurements of the air concentrations, the air emissions, and also we walk through the school to, I've looked at a lot of schools now and also other environments, and together, putting all that together, the data, the kinds of systems they have, the kind of materials they have, you can hone in much quicker on, okay, how do we do this effectively? And also capture the opportunity to link remodeling or remediation with energy efficiency, with COVID controls. In some parts of the United States, they're also concerned about wildfire or ozone outdoors, and trying to figure out how to provide better air quality indoors. You know, if we think about that, all those things together, including, you know, reduction of PCB exposures, you get double counting on all of it because it's almost all the same activities. It's frequent, for example, that old windows, old lighting, old HVAC system is part of the PCB problem. And that's also a big part of the energy efficiency problem, and could be part of the, you know, air quality problem in general. So, you know, having that all available, having the PCB levels available, knowing about the relationships between these materials and emissions, allows you to just prioritize. Now, how do we decide where to start, and how do we plan in an efficient way so that we capture the opportunity to make these other improvements in the facilities as we go?
Thank you, that's helpful. And I know, like, deciding where to waste stream, what goes in which waste stream is also gonna be an issue as we take on this work, because I know it is in Burlington. How do you, as a PCB expert, so for example, I would say generally in Vermont, our education system is, I'll just use the word struggling right now, coming out of COVID. Lots of high rates of mental health issues with the kids. There's a lot of, you know, bullying going on. We have a teacher shortage.
Yeah.
We have a general labor shortage. Our buildings are crumbling. We're struggling to recruit teachers. So it's already a system that is feeling kind of fragile and struggling. Again, would be the word I use. Like, I don't want to say crisis. I don't think it's crisis mode yet, but maybe heading in that direction. How do you layer on top of that structure, that ecosystem, this like sort of other, what's feeling like burden?
Yeah.
Because it's not just a financial issue, but also I think some schools have experienced that when they do have levels that might trigger an action, that there's not a lot of supports in place, and they're feeling that it's just been difficult. How do you like put those two together, mesh those two?
Senator, I completely agree. And the thing that's happened with our center at Iowa is that parents call us and they're fearful. And then sometimes they've got just a little tiny bit of information. Like well, there's some schools where parents have decided on their own to make a measurement somehow, and they've got a little measurement of a little bit of clocking from the corner of a room, and it's high PCBs. And parents have decided to take their kids out of school, decided to homeschool on this. They ask for more and more information. They ask us to guide them. And the thing that is, they don't have the data. They don't have the right data. They don't have guidance for interpreting the data. They don't have communications that help them put it all in perspective. I think that PCBs are scary. They're known human carcinogens. They're linked to ADHD and autism and heart disease and many other things. And people read that, they Google it, they say, oh my gosh, here these chemicals are in my school. Overreact. Yeah. Managing the process is not easy, and I'm very sympathetic to the schools as they manage this, but they need help beyond just the school principal trying to answer these questions. And certainly the tragedy of taking your kid out of school is so much worse, in my opinion. But people will do that when they don't have enough information. They panic naturally. And our center is really trying to help people with that. We're trying to release as much data as we can, make as much data available on our website. We have a community engagement arm that helps us with that. And yeah, I can see that's a really big challenge for you too. I must say, in working with the Department of Environmental Conservation, the PCB team here in Vermont, I've been really impressed with their communications. Unlike most places, Vermont is putting the data on the website, and you can look it up on your school, and so you can see all the data that's already been collected for your school, so you're not in the dark like many places are. And I imagine the schools that haven't been tested are also nervous because they haven't seen their data yet. But it's highly variable. Not every school is going to be in this situation. Lots of schools are not going to be in this situation. And people will be relieved. In some schools, they need to know they're in that situation.
Can you say something about the air and what that PCB in the air, what that impacts in terms of health? I mean, one of the things that was striking was you said people off of the coast of New Bedford
Live right next to New
near
Bedford Harbor. Right?
that they were inhaling
Yes.
PCB, whatever it might consider residue or whatever. At that point, it was 100 something or another. And then Senator Kulik, I believe, said Burlington was Tech Center was 6,000. Is that the same measurement?
Yes.
6,000.
Yes.
So, and those kids and teachers were working there for decades.
Yes.
And I guess I just keep coming back to, if there's another school out there for me, and I don't know if it's likely or not, I would want to know to get those kids and teachers out. 6,000,
Yes.
whereas you were concerned about 100.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
That's exactly right.
Thank you very much. Senator.
Follow up on that question. When you were talking about the study that you did earlier, I may have missed this, but were you seeing higher levels of illness in those folks?
We don't do that kind of work.
Oh, okay.
That's very difficult work. I want to mention we're all exposed to PCBs. All of us have PCBs in our blood. It's very difficult to find a community that has no PCB exposure. And this is one of the reasons that epidemiological studies are so difficult. So instead, what toxicologists do, or in addition to trying to design the right study of humans, is do animal studies, molecular studies, cellular studies to understand the health effects. Someone once asked me, how do you make a correlation between people who have ADHD, for example, and PCB exposure? And it's almost impossible to do because everybody has exposure to PCBs. You can't find a population that doesn't, right? And furthermore, PCBs are metabolized in our bodies. And so even though we measure it in our blood, doesn't necessarily mean that's all we're exposed to, because it converts to other chemicals that are still in our bodies and are much harder to analyze. So you can't design a study that's based simply on measuring people's blood. You have to know what they actually were exposed to, and usually know.
Question. We're at this moment, if you will, where there is we've heard from our Director of Public Health, Mark Wood, who was asked that we not stop testing. The House keeps talking about it as a pause, it would, for all intents and purposes, the way like just basically stop testing. And we're hearing, again, so tomorrow, I guess Dr. Harry Chen is zooming in from Africa. He was Dr. Levine's predecessor, who was also concerned about the possibility of us stopping testing. So we're hearing from medical professionals. Can you weigh in a little bit on the possibility or the options around this idea of stopping testing? It sounds like collecting data informs.
I think you have a wonderful opportunity with collecting this data.
Okay.
A wonderful opportunity to provide clear guidance to the schools. You have a wonderful opportunity to help them think strategically about it. Most of all, I think it's an opportunity to spend less on improving your school because you know how to start on this really critical health-related issue. I mean, what if it's a matter of repainting, or what if it's a matter of replacing the windows you already need to replace? Or, it's such a wide variety, but you don't know until you make the measurement, about where it is. You don't know the magnitude of it, and you don't know the specifics of where to start. You're lost in either doing nothing or doing far too much. And that concerns me in my community because some communities, in Iowa anyway, where we fund our schools locally. And so communities that don't have resources are unable to do anything. And it's only then the communities that have resources that are able to make these changes. And still, without the data, you can't make the changes in a feasible, effective way. You don't know what rate to go, how quickly to go. When you find 6,000 nanograms per cubic meter in your schoolroom, you feel a little bit differently about the urgency. Even then, what I used to think was a lot at 100, now I have a different opinion about it on the issue of urgency.
Yeah, sure.
But not on, I still want to find out where that is coming from. And remove it. If you measure PCBs above about 1 nanogram per cubic meter indoors, you have a source indoors. And you probably were going to measure that in probably every school that was built before 1980. And so, yes.
Would you want to finish your thought first?
Well, so we're not talking about going to zero, right?
Yeah.
You're not going to go to zero. What you're going to do is you're going to reduce the risk of health effects, and you're going to prioritize it according to the most severe.
So I would say in the Burlington school, this, but there was that one area was 6,000, but then it varied greatly all over the building. We had rooms with 0 and
Probably not 0 because they had a high detection limit.
Yeah.
Right. So my laboratory can go to 0.01 nanogram per cubic meter.
Okay.
But typically, when you get a consultant, they're between 10 and 20 nanograms per cubic meter. So you're probably not at 0.
Okay, maybe 10. There were a lot of 10. I don't remember, but
Right.
all I know is there were a couple that were extremely high and then mixed bag all over the place. But
Yeah.
what would you say I was reading a great piece from Denmark, which they're trying to rid all of their buildings, not just schools, all of their buildings of PCBs by 2028.
Yes.
And their two numbers were action level of 300 and immediate action level of 3,000. What do you make of those numbers for?
They had Denmark is an amazing situation. They built these residential towers for people, and a lot of them during between 1950 and 1980, and then they continued after 1980. And so they have towers that are PCB free and towers that are loaded with PCBs. Somebody was selling them very effectively there. And the levels were so high in those towers that had used PCBs. They also
so high, like
thousands, yeah, in the thousands. And in that case, they're so high, they could even see it, distinguish it in people's blood between the tower groups, which is indicative of really extreme exposure. Normally you can't see that because of metabolism of the PCBs. So the rest of us as PCB researchers have watched that, and that data is super valuable to us to understand about the situation. And they are trying to use that data also to understand the health effects. And it's still pretty challenging because PCBs cause health effects over a very long time period. And they're not immediately, we don't know how to look for them on the short term. And, but I think it will be valuable there. So I don't know how to answer your question because I don't think they can answer your question either. But they did make a decision about priority, right?
Yeah.
Because they have all the data, they can say, okay, we can afford to do this group on this scale and this time factor. Well, we're gonna leave this to a different time factor and different priority because they had the data, they can do that.
Senator Williams.
We've been receiving a lot of emails and phone calls from constituents that they're associated with the school.
Mhm.
And they're recommending, they want us to stop the testing.
Mhm.
And I said, well, you know, why do you want to do that? Well, basically the response I got was Vermont's standard for contamination is so much higher than the national EPA level.
Lower,
I don't
more
know.
stringent.
I don't know enough about it, so how do you respond to that?
Well, there isn't any national standard in the United States. And
For
in
air, right?
For air, there's rough guidance based on little information or very difficult to compile and organize information. The numbers that Vermont chose are entirely consistent with the literature about what we know about the potential for health effects based on animal studies, cellular studies, molecular studies, and indications from human epidemiological studies. They're totally reasonable numbers. I'm not a toxicologist, I'm an engineer, but of all the measurements that I've made and how people feel about having high concentrations near Superfund sites, I think they wouldn't really like having higher levels of these toxic chemicals in their schools than you would if you lived right next to this huge dump site. And they didn't know what their levels were, then they could worry that they're higher than they are, right? There's gonna be a range, and there's no zero value, even though the consultants might say non-detect, there'll still be some there. Helping people develop understanding that there's a range of concentrations, there's a range of risk, and we just want to move that all down. So we have less risk of exposure. We'll never make it zero, but also it'll never be horrible if we know what it is and we take some action. Always be a little better, and that's our goal for these toxic chemicals. Make it a little better, make it a little safer. Keep going.
So how can we work together with what's going on in Vermont, what you're doing?
So we'd love to, we already are really pleased to be partnering with Vermont. We're using our research methods in some schools to help hone in on specific sources. We're designing new samplers that are faster, more effective, and more direct in materials. We hope that'll help schools make more educated decisions, but yet Vermont's not using our data for regulatory purposes. It's just to help provide more information. And in my view, the communications that's happening here in Vermont is extraordinarily good. Keep doing that. Show people what the data is. Help them understand their situation better. Provide them even more advice and guidance. Yeah, really, it's been an honor to be involved in this here. Exciting.
So an excellent testimony. Appreciate all your activity. Question is, given 35 years in the profession, do you have a thought on why the EPA hasn't established something which all states can use as a relevant testing risk level?
I know they're working really hard. I know some of the toxicologists for EPA that are extraordinarily talented scientists. it's my opinion, and I could be wrong, is that the reason is because they don't know how they're gonna pay for it. Not the guidance, but the result of the guidance. What are we gonna do when they put out a guidance and thousands of schools across the country can't meet it, nor can they pay for the remediation? In my opinion, that's why they're not releasing it, because they have yet to figure out what they're gonna do. And I guess this is public and I should just go ahead and say it. But I know that we are spending billions of dollars on sediment remediation. And the reason we do is because of the fish consumption. But if people are not eating fish out of those contaminated areas, the next exposure we should be controlling is PCBs in school air. In the school air.
This has been excellent testimony and certainly confirms where I am on this issue. I don't think I've moved much. I would encourage you, and I know you're with Matt Chapman. I don't know if the House has heard this testimony, House Education, but I know they're starting to look into some, they weren't had time to talk to any medical professionals before I think they passed out their bills, so they're sort of jumping into that now. It would be helpful if
Happy to, we can.
I could
extend the
reach out
information.
to Representative Conlon, because this is really compelling, important testimony.
Well, thanks for
I
asking
think it's
me.
really important for everybody to hear.
Good luck.
Thank you. And you're heading out soon? You're going back?
Tomorrow afternoon, I think
Okay, all right. And are you in the building for the rest of the day or?
I can be.
Okay. Any other questions, Senator Kulik?
I think I've asked quite a few already.
Senator Williams? Really terrific. Yeah, thanks so much.
Yeah.
So we'll take a 10-minute break in case anybody wants to have additional conversations with Dr. Hornbuckle, as well as we have Matt Chapman here from the Agency of Natural Resources, and we'll come back and we'll jump in with